There are moments when a system begins to speak about itself without intending to. Not through declarations, not through official communiques, but through tone, through hesitation, through the sudden willingness of external actors to say aloud what they previously kept confined to private briefings. And recently, something shifted in that tone. It was subtle, almost procedural, yet unmistakable. A senior European leader stood on foreign soil and described the leadership in Tehran not as challenged, not as pressured, but as approaching its final stage. Not eventual reform, not negotiation fatigue, final stage. That phrasing was not accidental, it was calibrated. And when calibrated language changes, it usually reflects assessments made elsewhere, in rooms where probability is measured more carefully than rhetoric. The statement did not emerge in isolation. It arrived amid accelerating internal strain. Currency markets no longer behaving as markets, but as barometers of confidence loss. Exchange rates diverging so sharply between official and informal channels that they appear to describe two separate countries. The numbers themselves are stark, but what matters more is their velocity. When a national currency moves from erosion to free fall, the transition is rarely reversible without structural correction. And structural correction in this case has been conspicuously absent. Over 4 decades, the real has not simply weakened, it has disintegrated in relative terms. From double-digit exchange levels in the late 1970s to figures now exceeding 1 million per dollar in parallel markets. That kind of cumulative depreciation does more than reduce purchasing power. It rewrites expectations. It teaches a population that holding domestic currency is an act of risk, not stability. Once that lesson is internalized, monetary sovereignty becomes theoretical. Inflation data reinforces this pattern. Headline figures in the mid-40% range might suggest chronic instability. But food inflation exceeding 70% tells a different story. Food inflation is not abstract. It bypasses financial markets and reaches kitchens directly. When staple goods double in cost within months, household budgeting ceases to function as a discipline and becomes an improvisation. Savings lose meaning, contracts lose reliability, time horizons shorten. Economic contraction compounds the stress. Forecasts indicating consecutive years of shrinking output alongside accelerating prices describe a rare and dangerous configuration. Stagnation combined with inflation compresses real income at a pace that erodes social cohesion. It is not a single statistic that destabilizes a regime, it is the layering of them. Currency collapse, capital flight, declining investment, widening poverty bands, each can be managed individually. Together, they form a pattern that suggests systemic fatigue. And this is where the main thing begins, the reaction of the merchant class. When Tehran's Grand Bazaar reduced activity and traders publicly protested currency deterioration, it was not merely a demonstration about prices. Historically, the bazaar has functioned as connective tissue between commerce, clergy, and political authority. It helped sustain the very system now facing economic paralysis. When that network expresses open frustration, it signals not ideological revolt, but structural concern. Merchants do not close their shops lightly. They close them when predictability disappears. Meanwhile, capital has been moving quietly outward, tens of billions in estimated outflows over recent cycles. Capital flight is rarely emotional, it is anticipatory. Investors convert assets into portability when they calculate that domestic stabilization tools are either exhausted or inaccessible. And here, accessibility becomes crucial. Foreign exchange reserves may exist on paper, but when they are parked in opaque structures beyond direct institutional control, their defensive capacity is limited. Monetary intervention without liquidity is performance. International posture has evolved in parallel. Coordinated European statements criticizing internal crackdowns, discussions framed not solely around nuclear negotiations, but around political transition scenarios, even tariff threats from Washington aimed at isolating residual trade channels. None of these measures alone determine an outcome, yet their synchronization suggests that external governments are preparing for contingencies rather than merely urging reform. That shift from engagement to anticipation is rarely declared openly. It simply manifests through language. Oil revenue, historically the regime's stabilizing resource, no longer appears to translate into broad fiscal resilience. Discounted exports routed through alternative channels generate income, but allocation patterns prioritize security structures over civilian stabilization. When public perception aligns oil wealth with institutional protection rather than social relief, legitimacy strains, especially under visible austerity. Overlaying this is the succession question, an aging supreme authority, potential successors lacking either broad acceptance or consolidated power bases. Succession processes during economic contraction are inherently fragile. They require institutional unity. Unity is difficult to preserve when economic signals indicate contraction rather than expansion. At this point, the system usually shows its limits, not in dramatic collapse, but in administrative delay, in inconsistent policy signals, in the widening gap between official narrative and lived experience. There are now effectively two economies operating in parallel, one governed by controlled rates and subsidies, another dictated by informal markets. The gap between them has become too large to ignore. And when a country functions on dual monetary realities, trust becomes selective. It would be premature to declare inevitability. Systems under pressure often endure longer than observers predict. Yet the language used by external leaders suggests access to assessments not publicly shared. And when major European economies begin discussing peaceful transition frameworks while domestic currency slides and commercial centers protest, the alignment of signals becomes difficult to dismiss as coincidence. But this part is rarely discussed openly. Regimes do not fall solely because of poverty or protest. They weaken when the mechanisms designed to absorb shock begin to misfire, when monetary tools no longer stabilize, when patronage networks strain under resource allocation, when succession planning intersects with economic contraction. We are approaching that intersection, and the silence surrounding the most sensitive variables is becoming more noticeable than the statements themselves. The break occurs not at the moment of protest and not at the moment of currency collapse. It occurs when the instruments designed to manage both begin to operate against each other. That is where the structure reveals itself, and that is where we continue. The Iranian system was engineered to survive isolation. It developed parallel financial channels, shadow intermediaries, extraterritorial holding structures. Sanctions did not eliminate revenue, they redirected it. Oil flows continued through discounted contracts, ship-to-ship transfers, secondary routing networks. Foreign currency accumulated outside direct central bank custody, protected from seizure but equally insulated from domestic deployment. This architecture preserved strategic autonomy. It did not preserve macroeconomic stability. Here lies the contradiction. The reserves that exist cannot be mobilized without exposing the channels that protect them. To defend the currency aggressively would require transparency. Transparency would invite enforcement. Enforcement would sever remaining trade arteries. The state therefore tolerates depreciation rather than risk full exposure. Currency defense becomes symbolic. The market understands this. And markets price credibility, not intention. This is why the exchange rate gap widened beyond functional limits. Official rates sustain subsidized imports and internal accounting. Parallel rates govern actual transactions. The spread between them is no longer frictional, it is structural. Arbitrage becomes a political activity. Access to official rates creates privileged corridors. Those without access operate in a separate economy altogether. Over time, this produces not only inflation but stratification. Monetary duality evolves into social segmentation. The inflation cycle itself is mechanical. Fiscal deficits expand under shrinking real output. Financing occurs through monetary expansion. Monetary expansion accelerates depreciation. Depreciation feeds import costs. Import costs amplify food inflation. Food inflation erodes wage value. Wage erosion pressures the state towards subsidy expansion. Subsidy expansion enlarges deficits again. This loop does not require mismanagement. It requires constraint without adjustment capacity. Oil revenue does not interrupt the cycle because allocation is not optimized for civilian stabilization. Budgetary design prioritizes security continuity. Security continuity requires liquidity. Liquidity demands revenue channels immune to external interference. Those channels, by design, remain insulated from domestic rebalancing. Thus, the same architecture that protects the regime internationally weakens it internally. Capital flight is the rational response to this configuration. Domestic actors do not wait for political declarations. They observe liquidity constraints and rate divergence. When investors convert assets into external holdings, they are not expressing ideology. They are calculating optionality. The more capital exits, the more pressure accumulates on domestic currency. Each outflow reduces the state's room to maneuver. The process feeds on expectation. The merchant class involvement is consequential because it disrupts the informal contract between commerce and authority. Historically, the bazaar functioned as logistical infrastructure for governance. It absorbed volatility in exchange for regulatory protection. When volatility becomes unmanageable and protection insufficient, that exchange weakens. Once weakened, administrative compliance declines. Tax flows contract. Informal networks fragment. Externally, the synchronized positioning of European governments in Washington reflects risk modeling rather than moral judgment. When officials begin referencing transition frameworks, they are not predicting collapse with certainty. They are mapping contingencies. Contingency planning alters investment perception. Investors treat it as probability weighting. That weighting influences capital allocation decisions. The feedback loop becomes internationalized. The succession variable intensifies fragility because authority consolidation during contraction is structurally difficult. Potential successors lack uniform legitimacy across military, clerical, and commercial blocs. In expansionary periods, patronage can smooth succession. In contractionary periods, patronage shrinks. Shrinking patronage exposes rivalries. Rivalries during monetary instability amplify uncertainty. At this stage, the system does not implode. It hardens, controls tighten, enforcement increases. But enforcement cannot print purchasing power, nor can it eliminate rate divergence. The more rigid the administrative response, the more adaptive informal markets become. Informal markets eventually set the reference reality. When that occurs, official data loses signaling power. The redenomination proposal illustrates the limitation clearly. Removing zeros from the currency simplifies accounting. It does not restore credibility. Credibility depends on expectation management. Expectation management depends on perceived institutional control. Institutional control depends on access to deployable reserves and policy flexibility. Both are constrained. The result is not immediate collapse, but narrowing bandwidth. Fewer policy options. Reduced fiscal elasticity. Increasing reliance on security instruments over economic instruments. This shift is measurable in budget composition and in rhetoric. When stabilization tools become primarily coercive rather than financial, the architecture reveals strain. The uncomfortable element is not whether the system survives months or years. Systems under pressure can persist through adaptation. The uncomfortable element is that adaptation here requires sustaining a dual economy indefinitely while external actors prepare for structural change. Dual economies generate erosion from within. External preparation accelerates expectation shifts from without. At this intersection, timing becomes unpredictable, not because variables are unknown, but because they are interdependent. Currency stabilization requires liquidity. Liquidity requires exposure. Exposure risks isolation. Avoiding exposure sustains depreciation. Depreciation sustains unrest. Unrest sustains enforcement. Enforcement sustains external coordination. The loop is self-referential, and when a system becomes self-referential under contraction, it does not fail dramatically. It compresses. Institutions operate, but narrower. Markets function, but distorted. Authority persists, but defensive. That is the structural condition now forming. Not a headline event, not a singular rupture, a tightening configuration in which each stabilizing mechanism weakens another. And once that configuration stabilizes in its constrained state, reversal becomes less a matter of will and more a matter of capacity.